there is a moment people completely miss. Not the moment an empath breaks, not the moment they cry, not even the moment they walk away. It is quieter than that. It happens when their nervous system stops reaching. And if you have ever experienced this yourself, you already know how disturbing that silence feels because empaths are not naturally silent people internally. Their minds are constantly scanning emotional environments, constantly measuring tension in someone's voice, the pause before a text reply, the heaviness in a room no one else notices. They absorb microshifts in human behavior the way lungs absorb oxygen, not consciously at first, it becomes automatic. Their nervous system learns survival through emotional tracking. Most people think empathy is kindness, but deep empathy is hypervigilance disguised as love. An empath learns early that safety depends on reading people correctly. They become experts at emotional anticipation. They sense disappointment before words appear, anger before tone changes, distance before abandonment arrives. And over time, this creates a dangerous psychological loop. Their body never truly rests. Even in calm moments, part of them is still watching, still decoding, still preparing emotionally for impact that may never come. Have you noticed this about yourself? How exhausting it feels to be around emotionally inconsistent people? How your chest tightens when someone's energy changes slightly? How your mind immediately begins searching for what you did wrong? Most people never realize this. The empath's nervous system is not reacting only to the present moment. It is reacting to emotional memory, every ignored feeling, every unstable attachment, every moment they had to emotionally survive someone unpredictable. The body remembers all of it. And eventually, something changes, not suddenly, not dramatically, silently. At first, the empath still cares. They still overthink. They still wait for emotional reassurance. Rants. But deep underneath that attachment, exhaustion begins accumulating. Emotional fatigue starts converting sensitivity into numbness. The nervous system realizes something the empath's heart has not accepted yet. Constant emotional pursuit is unsafe. This is where the shift begins, because an empath can tolerate pain for a very long time, far longer than most people understand. They can rationalize neglect, minimize emotional inconsistency, translate coldness into stress, translate distance into they're just overwhelmed. Empaths are experts at emotionally protecting other people from accountability. But the nervous system keeps score even when the mind refuses to. And eventually, the body reaches a threshold. Imagine a silence so heavy it feels physical, not peace, not relief, a strange emotional stillness. The overthinking slows, the emotional scanning weakens, the desperate need to reconnect disappears, and suddenly the empath notices something terrifying. They know. Not longer feel the same emotional pull toward the person they once could not stop thinking about. This confuses people because from the outside it looks calm, mature, detached, but internally something profound has happened. The empath's nervous system has entered emotional recalibration. The body has stopped interpreting the connection as emotionally survivable. Most people never realize this is not revenge. It is biological shutdown. The nervous system cannot sustain prolonged emotional instability forever. At some point, subconscious adaptation takes over. The empath begins internally regulating through emotional withdrawal rather than emotional pursuit. And once this happens internally, the connection changes permanently. That is the dangerous moment, not because the empath becomes cruel, but because they stop emotionally chasing resolution. You can always tell when an empath still loves you. They explain themselves too much. They still react emotionally. They still try to, repair misunderstandings. They still hope you will finally understand their pain. But when their nervous system goes silent, all of that disappears. No more emotional pleading, no more over explaining, no more chasing emotional clarity, only distance. And the frightening part is, it rarely looks dramatic. There is no explosion, no speech, no theatrical goodbye, just absence, cold emotional absence. The kind that slowly fills a room until the other person finally notices something is wrong. But by then, the empath is already psychologically halfway gone. There is a moment people completely miss. The moment the empath stops waiting emotionally, that moment changes everything because attachment dynamics operate through emotional reinforcement. The empath keeps investing emotionally because their nervous system still believes connection is possible. Even inconsistent affection can sustain attachment if hope remains alive. But once hope dies internally, the nervous system begins. It ends restructuring itself around emotional self-protection instead of emotional access. This is why empaths often appear different after emotional exhaustion. Their voice changes, their energy changes, their presence changes, not intentionally. Their body is conserving itself. Most people think emotional detachment is a decision. Usually it is not. It is the final stage of nervous system exhaustion. And strangely, this is often when the other person suddenly panics. Have you noticed this? When the empath finally becomes quiet, people who ignored them often become obsessed with regaining access to them. Suddenly, they want communication, reassurance, emotional closeness, validation. But here's what changes everything: the empath's silence is no longer performative, it is physiological. Their body has already learned emotional distance. This is why reconnection feels different after the shift. Even if the empath tries to reopen emotionally, something inside resists. The nervous system remembers the emotional cost of attachment. The body associates closeness with depletion. And this creates one of the most haunting psychological transformations an empath can experience. They begin grieving someone while still talking to them. Externally, the relationship may continue, conversations continue, daily routines continue, but emotionally, the empath is slowly withdrawing investment from the connection. They stop imagining a future, stop expecting emotional consistency, stop believing vulnerability will be handled carefully. And once emotional expectation disappears, attachment begins collapsing internally. Most people never realize this. The opposite of attachment is not hatred, it is emotional neutrality. Hatred still contains emotional energy. Silence does not. That silence is what terrifies people, because when an empath truly detaches, they no longer need the emotional reaction they once depended on. They stop trying to be understood by someone committed, tended to misunderstanding them. The nervous system stops fighting for emotional reciprocity that never consistently existed. And suddenly the empath becomes hard to reach, not physically, energetically. Their warmth disappears first, then their emotional curiosity, then the subtle softness they used to carry into every interaction. People often describe this change incorrectly. They say the empath became cold, but coldness is intentional distance. What actually happens is emotional depletion transforms into subconscious protection. The empath is no longer emotionally available in the same way because their body no longer trusts connection. There is a difference, and deep down the empath feels it too. At night, they notice the silence first. No more obsessive replaying of conversations. No more nervous anticipation before messages. No more emotional spiraling over someone's behavior. Just stillness. For many empaths, this silence initially feels wrong because they have them. Istakon emotional intensity for emotional connection their entire lives. Chaos became familiar. Hypervigilance became intimacy. Emotional unpredictability became attraction. So when the nervous system finally quiets, the empath sometimes mistakes peace for emptiness. This is where the subconscious conflict begins. Part of them misses the emotional stimulation, even if it was hurting them, because trauma-conditioned attachment creates chemical dependency on emotional inconsistency. Intermittent affection activates powerful nervous system responses. The empath becomes emotionally addicted to searching for reassurance. And when that cycle stops, withdrawal begins. Most people never realize how physical emotional attachment actually is. The chest tightness, the cortisol spikes, the sleep disruption, the constant mental scanning. The body experiences unstable emotional attachment almost like survival stress, which is why silence feels so strange afterward. The body is finally leaving, survival mode. But there is another side to this transformation people rarely talk about. When an empath's nervous system goes silent, they also begin seeing people clearly for the first time, not through potential, not through emotional fantasy, not through hope, reality. And reality can feel brutal after emotional idealization collapses. They suddenly recognize how often they were emotionally carrying conversations, how frequently they minimized disrespect, how much energy they invested trying to preserve emotional harmony while the other person contributed inconsistency. This awareness is psychologically devastating because the empath realizes something painful. They were not emotionally safe. They were emotionally adaptive. There is a difference people completely miss. Empaths often confuse endurance with connection. They believe surviving emotional instability together creates intimacy. But true emotional safety does not require constant nervous system activation. Healthy love does not feel like emotional survival. And once the empath experiences this realization internally, their identity begins restructuring. This is where the shift becomes irreversible. Because emotional detachment is not only separation from another person, it is separation from a former version of self. The version that overextended, overexplained, overgave, overweighted. The empath starts recognizing patterns they once romanticized, why they felt drawn toward emotionally unavailable people, why inconsistency intensified attachment instead of weakening it, why emotional unpredictability felt magnetic instead of dangerous. Most people never realize this. The empath is not only grieving people, they are grieving the nervous system patterns that shape their identity. And that grief feels existential because when emotional hypervigilance disappears, the empath sometimes no longer recognizes themselves. Their personality shifts subtly. They become quieter, more observant, harder to emotionally access. They stop volunteering vulnerability so easily, not because they lost depth, because depth without safety became psychologically expensive. There is a moment people completely miss, the moment an empath stops trying to save the connection alone. That moment does not happen in anger, it happens in exhaustion. And exhaustion changes human behavior in ways people underestimate. The empath begins conserving emotional energy automatically. Their responses shorten. Their emotional availability shrinks. Their tolerance for inconsistency collapses. Things they once accepted suddenly feel unbearable. This is subconscious adaptation. The nervous system recalibrates standards after prolonged emotional depletion. The body begins protecting itself from further dysregulation. And strangely, this often confuses the people around them because the empath used to tolerate everything. They used to stay calm during emotional chaos, used to keep understanding page. People who offered very little understanding in return used to absorb tension silently while trying to preserve closeness. But once the nervous system shifts, the empath stops translating harmful behavior into acceptable explanations. And that changes relationship dynamics permanently. People become uncomfortable when emotional access is no longer unlimited, especially people who unconsciously relied on the empath's emotional labor. Have you noticed this about yourself? How some people only became emotionally attentive once you emotionally withdrew? This happens because many relationships unconsciously depend on imbalance. One person tracks emotional harmony while the other passively receives it. One person overfunctions emotionally while the other underfunctions. The empath often becomes the emotional regulator of the entire connection until their nervous system can no longer carry it. Then suddenly, everything destabilizes because once the empath stops emotionally compensating for the relationship, the imbalance becomes visible. And visibility changes everything. Most people never realize how much emotional work empaths perform invisibly. The reassurance, the tension management, the emotional anticipation, the silent self abandonment disguised as patience. But eventually, the body refuses further self erasure. This is why the silence feels so haunting. It is not only silence toward another person, it is the end of internal emotional overextension. And for many empaths, this creates an unfamiliar sensation space, psychological space. For the first time in years, their mind is not revolving entirely around someone else's emotional state. They wake up without immediately checking emotional tension. They stop monitoring mood shifts obsessively. They stop carrying emotional responsibility for people unwilling to carry their own. At first, this freedom feels disorienting because emotional chaos once gave their nervous system purpose. But here, that's what changes everything. The empath slowly realizes how much of their identity was built around emotional survival rather than emotional fulfillment. And once they see that clearly, they cannot unsee it. This realization creates cognitive detachment. The emotional fantasy collapses. The empath stops asking, how do I make this work? And begins asking, why did I accept this for so long? That question is psychologically dangerous because it forces the empath to confront uncomfortable truths about attachment, self worth, and subconscious conditioning. They begin recognizing how often they confuse being needed with being loved, how often they felt valuable only when emotionally rescuing someone, how deeply their nervous system associated self sacrifice with connection. Most people never realize this. Some empaths were never taught that love could feel calm, so they learn to equate emotional intensity with emotional significance. And that conditioning follows them into adulthood. They become attracted to emotional puzzles, to people who trigger longing, uncertainty, and consistency. Their nervous system mistakes emotional unpredictability for depth because chaos feels familiar. But when the nervous system finally goes silent, attraction itself begins changing. The empath no longer feels magnetized by emotional instability the same way. In fact, inconsistency begins repelling them. This is one of the clearest signs identity restructuring has begun internally. The body stops romanticizing what once dysregulated it. And suddenly the empath notices something strange. Peace feels unfamiliar but necessary. There is a moment people completely miss. The moment the empath stops fearing abandonment. Not because they trust people more, because they trust themselves to survive emotional loss now. That changes the entire nervous system. Fear no longer controls attachment in the same way. The empath stops clinging emotionally to preserve connection at all costs. They stop abandoning themselves to avoid losing someone else. And this creates emotional presence without desperation, a completely different kind of energy. People feel this shift immediately. The empath becomes harder to manipulate emotionally because their nervous system is no longer operating from fear based attachment. Guilt stops working the same way. Emotional inconsistency stops creating obsession. Silence stops triggering panic. The body has learned something profound. Survival does not require emotional self destruction. And once this realization settles into the nervous system, relationships begin filtering themselves naturally. Emotionally unsafe people drift away first because they were attached to the empath's emotional availability, not necessarily the empath themselves. That truth hurts. But it also clarifies everything. The empath begins noticing who only valued them when they were endlessly understanding, endlessly patient, endlessly emotional, lie accessible. And once the empath develops boundaries rooted in nervous system protection instead of guilt, some relationships collapse immediately, not because the empath changed unfairly, because balance exposes incompatibility. This is where the silence becomes transformative instead of painful. The empath starts experiencing emotional reciprocity differently. They stop chasing emotional breadcrumbs, stop trying to decode mixed signals, stop romanticizing emotional confusion. Clarity becomes more attractive than intensity. That sentence alone changes entire lives because many empaths unknowingly spend years addicted to emotional ambiguity. The uncertainty keeps the nervous system engaged, keeps hope activated, keeps emotional pursuit alive. But emotional peace requires something different: consistency, safety, emotional accountability. And once the nervous system experiences those things genuinely, old attachment patterns start feeling unbearable. Most people never are. Not Ely's healing often feels emotionally boring at first, not because it lacks depth, because the nervous system is detoxing from chaos. And during that detox, the empath may feel empty temporarily. They may mistake emotional calmness for lack of connection because their body became conditioned to associate anxiety with love. But over time, the silence changes texture. It stops feeling lonely. It starts feeling protective, then restorative, then powerful. The empath begins hearing themselves again underneath all the emotional noise they absorbed for years. Their intuition sharpens differently now, not through hypervigilance, through internal regulation. That distinction matters because hypervigilance exhausts the nervous system. Intuition emerges from nervous system safety. And when an empath finally reaches that state, their entire emotional reality changes. They stop trying to earn basic emotional care, stop negotiating for consistency, stop shrinking themselves to maintain connection. The body no longer tolerates emotional environments that require self betrayal. This is why the silence feels dangerous to other people, because once an empath emotionally detaches at the nervous system level, external manipulation loses power. Fear loses leverage. Emotional inconsistency loses attraction. The empath becomes emotionally unavailable to dysfunction itself. And people who benefited from their previous self abandonment can feel that shift immediately. There is a moment people completely miss: the moment the empath realizes they were never asking for too much. They were asking the wrong people. That realization restructures identity from the inside out. The empath stops viewing sensitivity as weakness, stops apologizing for emotional depth, stops treating their intuition like irrationality, because they finally understand something profound. Their nervous system was never the enemy. It was warning them every time emotional exhaust. Ion followed connection, every time anxiety replaced peace, every time they felt emotionally smaller around someone instead of emotionally safe. The body knew long before the mind accepted it. And once the empath begins listening to those signals instead of overriding them, life changes quietly but completely. They become selective with emotional access, selective with vulnerability, selective with energy, not cold, intentional. Most people never realize how deeply an empath feels emotional environments internally. A single emotionally unsafe relationship can dysregulate their entire nervous system for years. Sleep changes, focus changes, identity changes, which is why healing for an empath is never only emotional, it is physiological. The body must relearn safety, and that relearning takes time. Sometimes the empath will miss people who harmed them emotionally, not because the connection was healthy, because attachment leaves residue in the nervous system. Emotional memory lingers inside the body long after logic understands the truth. This creates confusing grief. The empath may know someone was emotionally unsafe while still craving their presence. That contradiction can feel humiliating internally, but it is simply evidence of how deeply attachment shapes neurobiology. Healing means teaching the body what safety feels like again, without chaos, without confusion, without emotional survival. And eventually, the silence no longer feels empty, it feels honest. The empath begins recognizing how loud emotional dysfunction always was, how much anxiety they normalize, how often they abandon themselves trying to preserve attachment. And with that realization comes something unexpected: compassion for themselves. Not the performative kind, not motivational language, real compassion. The kind that finally understands why they stayed too long, why they overgave, why they ignored their own nervous system repeatedly trying to protect them. Because survival patterns are difficult to recognize while living inside them. Most people never realize this. The empath was often trying to recreate emotional resolution they never received earlier in life, trying to finally be chosen consistently, finally understood fully, finally loved without emotional instability attached to it. But unresolved attachment wounds turn connection into pursuit, and pursuit exhausts the nervous system. Eventually, the body refuses to keep running. That is the dangerous moment. The moment the empath's nervous system goes silent. Because once this happens internally, the connection changes permanently. The empath may still care, still remember, still grieve, but they no longer abandon themselves trying to hold on to someone emotionally unavailable. And that changes every relationship afterward. The silence becomes a boundary built not from anger, but awareness. The awareness that emotional peace is not supposed to feel unreachable. That love is not supposed to require constant nervous system recovery. That connection should not leave the body chronically anxious. And once an empath experiences that realization deeply enough, there is no returning to who they were before. Because the old version of them survived through emotional hypervigilance. The new version survives through internal safety. And those are two completely different people. In the end, the most haunting part is not that the empath becomes silent. It is that most people only notice their value after the silence arrives, after the warmth disappears, after the emotional labor stops, after the nervous system finally withdraws access. But by then, something irreversible has already happened internally. The empath has finally stopped confusing emotional suffering with love. And once that lesson settles into the nervous system, the silence no longer feels tragic. It feels like coming home.